What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and it is Dataslate Day because the Q4 2022 Balanced Dataslate was just released at long last on Warhammer Community this morning, and it's an exciting day for Warhammer 40k players. So let's go through all of the changes to this Dataslate and how they may affect the Warhammer 40,000 metagame. Now, obviously, the metagame has been in a pretty good spot lately, and one of the biggest points of discussion around this data slate has been the level to which it should be trying to rebalance the most powerful or least powerful armies in the game. Now, it seems that the direction GW has taken this time around has been a very level-headed one. We're seeing some very slight changes to the top and bottom factions in the game, but nothing too wildly transformative. I did a live stream earlier this week for Tactical Tuesday talking about some of the changes that I would like to see made in the data slate. And a lot of them are represented here, but GW certainly didn't go as far as I might have in rebalancing some of the game's top factions. Now, one thing that we didn't see is a new update to the Munitorum field manual. So no points values thus far have been changed. However, the data slate does include some changes to the Warzone Nephilim secondaries, at least for Space Marine specifically. So what we're going to do is go through this nice MetaWatch article that GW has. This is released, obviously, today, the 20th of October, 2022. And it goes through in concise detail the changes that were made in the new data slate document. So Tyranids got two changes. First off, the High Fleet Leviathan adaptive trait to give transhuman only affects monsters now. That's something that we talked about on my live stream that I would like to have seen is the fact that it works on large bricks of warriors, one of the most efficient troops options in the faction and in the game, is probably too strong. It gives you the transhuman effect on too many models across the entirety of your army, and monsters already have access to a transhuman effect, which means that this is basically just a discount to something that they could already be using through the Indomitable Monstrosity stratagem. Now, there is a little bit of weirdness with this change, which is that warriors being synapse units will no longer benefit from the High Fleet Leviathan subfaction ability. Normally, other infantry units would get the Stalwart effect, so they can only be wounded on a 3+ rather than a 4+. However, that excludes synapse units. So warriors being non-monsters don't get the transhuman effect, and being synapse units don't get the stalwart effect. This also affects other synapse infantry, so things like Tyranid primes, neurothropes, zoanthropes, all of those are no longer going to be particularly useful in a Leviathan list. Honestly, I'm not sure how big of a deal this is. There are going to be some situations where it does suck if your opponent has wound buffs or particularly high strength weapons that you don't get that stalwart effect. Although that doesn't happen super often, and most of the time people are wounding warriors on 3s anyway, being toughness 5. But it is certainly worth mentioning, and probably an oversight in this change. The other change was to the Reaper of Obliterax relic. This, in my opinion, wasn't quite as big of an issue as the transhuman effect. I personally, outside of some matchups, don't actually take the Reaper of Obliterax, at least on the first Tyrant that I bring. It's maybe a second Tyrant pick, but usually I'm playing Maw-Claws of Thyrax to save a ton of CP on rerolls. The Reaper of Obliterax was a very powerful relic that was taken on most Tyrant builds. That dealt mortal wounds in addition to normal damage and ignores phase caps on the damage from the initial attacks from the weapon. Now, the mortal wounds that it deals in addition have been reduced down to 3. One of the big use cases of the Reaper of Obliterax was essentially to double your damage against 1 wound infantry. Because you deal damage from the regular attack, then the mortal wounds applied to the weapon would apply after your combat step, so another 5 damage would be applied to the unit, and that could spill over to multiple models. So you could be potentially killing 12 models with 5 attacks from the Reaper of Obliterax. That's no longer the case, which means that 10 model 1 wound infantry units is going to be a lot tougher for Hive Tyrants to take down. I also expected some points changes to happen here, specifically for things like Hive Tyrants and Warriors that make up the bulk of most competitive Tyranid lists, but none of that's changing, just specifically these mechanics. And we may see a move a little bit away from these High Fleet Leviathan lists now. We may be pushing towards Kraken or Behemoth or some of the other builds that are going to be very strong. Harlequins have received a very slight nerf to the light Sadith, which was generally the best performing Sadith out of all of the sub-factions available to the faction, which changed their counts as remain stationary clause on their ability to only apply if you are not embarked inside a transport. Previously, this allowed you to put 6 Harlequin troopers in a Starweaver, equip them with a bunch of different pistols. You could take 2 fusion pistols and 2 neurodisruptors, and then advance that transport up the table, shoot with the transport without penalty thanks to the assault weapon profiles on the shuriken cannons, and then all of the models inside counted as remaining stationary and could fire normally. Now they can't shoot if you advance the transport, which does restrict the threat range of light Sadith troops quite a bit. Although I don't know how much it actually changes the game plan. I know a lot of other Sadists had been playing the Pistolier troop squads just moving the Starweaver up into range, and still threats about 22 inches on the fusion pistols inside that Starweaver. So I think that it will still be fine. This is a very light slap on the wrist for Harlequins players, and will not change the function of the faction in a lot of situations. While we're in the mood for some nerfs to top factions, we did see a little change to Necrons here. I was wondering if we were going to see changes to sub-faction abilities or to secondary objectives, because those are generally the strength of Necrons right now, but the change that we've gotten here is removal of the core keyword from vehicle characters. This is a change that I asked for in my stream. It is strange that Necron characters are the only ones, almost the only ones in the game that affect themselves with their own support auras, and the ability to My Will Be Done themselves is pretty silly. This also removes a much complained about interaction where you could take a model like a Seraph and Technomancer or Illuminor Seraz and be regenerating the Menhirs on the Silent King since they were core keyworded. That is no longer the case. You can't do that. So once those Menhirs go down, they're dead permanently. And the Silent King himself is going to be a little bit less of a powerhouse. He's still probably an auto-include. It just doesn't have the same level of late game consistency that he had previously, with the ability to reroll his own hit rolls with his ranged attacks or the ability to reroll his wound rolls with his melee attacks. That also makes Code of Combat a lot more difficult for Necron armies to complete, especially since now their Catacomb command barges are not receiving all of the support from their other characters, especially things like the Silent King. So that does hamper their secondary game in a little bit of a minor way, but for the most part, the oppressive nature of Necron full army obsec and pregame moves in some situations is still going to be present. That said, Necrons have been a relatively inconsistent army competitively, despite the fact that their secondary objective scoring is so strong. They haven't, been entirely undefeated, and they generally are just very good. Out of all of the armies in 40k, Space Marines are probably the one that needs buffs the most. Approaching Space Marines as a super faction as a whole, they had a pretty abysmal win rate down in the high 30s. And if you look at each chapter individually, they have some incredibly abysmal win rates, with Imperial Fists down in the mid 20%. That said, Games Workshop has elected to look at the faction holistically rather than go through and change individual sub-factions. I would like to see some sub-factions change because they do have a relatively wide player base compared to sub-factions out of other factions, but I understand the difficulty of balancing each individual sub-faction in an army, since Space Marines are the only faction that we really consider that way. Generally speaking, the win rate of the most optimized sub-faction in an army is the one that we typically look at when we're looking at the balance and the success of that army. So that makes Space Marines a little bit of an awkward one to rebalance, because if you were to make any sweeping changes to the faction, they would not only affect those Imperial Fists who really need a change, but they would also affect a lot of the supplement chapters like Blood Angels or Space Wolves, who, while are below the pale right now in the competitive metagame, are not too far down the track. You also start hitting Codex factions like Iron Hands, who is probably the best and most consistent Space Marine army over the whole of the edition. So for that reason, I think they've taken a very light touch to Space Marines. I think we could have done more here, and I was expecting to see some points cost reductions, but the only thing that we have changed is a change to the Warzone Nephilim secondary shock tactics, and now scores 4 VP if you steal an objective from your opponent rather than just 3. This means it's maxable in only 4 turns rather than 5, but the requirements to score are the same, that being that you take an objective away from the enemy. This means that secondary objective scoring for some Space Marine armies is going to be a little bit more consistent, although factions like Blood Angels already have a built-in faction secondary that they were taking already with Relentless Assault, so I don't know how much this is going to change too many of the non-codex compliant factions. Again, I wish we saw points cuts for codex models here. In this case, we just saw the Warzone Nephilim secondary change, and it's interesting that we saw only a secondary change to Adeptus Astartes and no other factions. I'll get on my soapbox a little bit here and say that I think it's a little bit insulting that this change was so minor to the faction. Every single Space Marine sub-faction is below a 50% win rate in the current competitive scene, and the statement that, oh, it's just because they're mostly a new player army doesn't give the Space Marine community and the good players in it enough credit. The power level of Space Marines holistically are hard to identify because they typically have such a heavy player base of their less powerful sub-factions. So armies like Iron Hands or Blood Angels that are very effective get dragged down by things like Imperial Fists. That said, even those top echelon armies aren't doing super hot right now, and the faction needs a much deeper revision than a single secondary change that isn't useful for a lot of the sub-factions that already have Battlefield Supremacy secondaries. Not to mention the fact that without any other changes, Shock Tactics is still kind of difficult to score. It requires your opponent to be on an objective that's in your own threat range, and Space Marines don't typically have a very long threat range to begin with. If the secondary allowed you to score by taking objectives that you did not control at the start of the turn, meaning that an objective in no man's land with no enemy models on it could score you 4 VPs for stealing it, I think this would actually be a pretty legitimately strong change. The fact that it requires your opponent to lock onto those objectives and in a lot of situations is unscorable during the first battle round, since your opponent will simply not take the objective that you will then take back to score Shock Tactics on, means that it gets even tougher to max out. Now with this change, it is possible to max it out, whereas previously if you cut it for a turn, it would cap at 12 points, meaning the secondary wasn't actually that good. The fact that you'd have to be stealing an objective from your opponent every turn of the game for all 5 rounds is kind of difficult. Conjoined with the fact that Space Marines, generally speaking, have overcosted units and under-tuned damage output in a lot of situations, this is just not far enough. Now, Adeptus Mechanicus was the other faction that was stuck there down at the bottom edge of the competitive metagame and did see a couple of updates. Specifically, they've just moved every restriction that was in the Dataslate to begin with. Now, I believe that the only remaining changes in the Adeptus Mechanicus section of the Dataslate were a nerf to the Lucian sub-faction ability that made it not stack with light cover. Because you could use Fired Point Telemetry Cache to improve your saves while you're in light cover, or you count yourself in light cover already, Lucian could make your units incredibly resilient, giving you a 2+ or 1+ save in some situations. Now, that restriction no longer applies, so you are free to stack those benefits, light cover plus the Lucian sub-faction ability. The other change was the nerf to Enriched Rounds. Enriched Rounds was printed as giving a Gene Rot Might effect to radium weapons in your Skitarii Vanguard units, improving it to automatic wounds on a 6+ to hit to automatic wounds on a 4+. Everyone sort of assumed this was a typo, and while it was really broken when the faction initially released, it did get changed in a Dataslate pretty quickly to reduce that to 5+. That's been removed now, and now we have those radium carbines automatically wounding people on 4s. I think that the release of Leagues of Votann, who have basically the same ability except the access to it army-wide, maybe made Games Workshop rethink where their stance in this particular effect. Whether or not it's super busted in the current metagame, I'm not sure. It certainly gives a little bit of a silver bullet to factions like Tyranids, who are still, in my opinion, going to be incredibly strong after this Dataslate update, but having no vehicles in their army are incredibly susceptible to that enriched round stratagem. It's important to note that Mechanicus has received a lot of nerfs in their actual Codex FAQ. Things like galvanic field abilities being able to stack have not been removed by this Dataslate change, literally only the changes in the Dataslate. And that's it. That's all of the changes in this Q4 Dataslate 2022. Again, we do not have a Munitorum field manual document, so we have no points changes to the game. Very limited mechanical changes, and I think the deft hand that GW has taken here is pretty appropriate. With the health of the 40k metagame right now, we didn't need too many changes, I think, to keep things relatively consistent. And while I definitely expected a little bit of a harder knock to the top factions of the metagame, I do appreciate that they want to keep the meta, pretty stable at this point. We are looking down the barrel of an Astra Militarum Codex, and so Astra Militarum did not get any changes whatsoever, which is something that the designers did call out specifically, so that does have the potential to change a lot of things in the totality of the game, but we'll just have to see how it goes. And with that, that's all I have to say about this new Dataslate document. Let me know down in the comments what you think about this, and if you're excited to play in this new and evolving 40k metagame post all of these changes. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.